Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I am your host today, Jen, and I am joined by a fantastic writer of a book that really just it consumed my whole last weekend, and I'm just so excited to talk about it. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yeah, my name is Kevin Allardice. I am a fiction writer, and this novel, Weft, it's my fifth book. It's the first inaugural publication with Madrona Books, and it is the story of a mother and her teenage son who, when we meet them at the beginning of the book, they're con artists. They're sort of making their way around the country with this particular con that they've sort of perfected, revolving around pretending that she is a casting director for the upcoming Star Wars prequels. This takes place in the late 90s, around the time that news of the Star Wars prequels was getting a lot of traction, and so they've come up with this con to sort of capitalize on that interest, and then we find out sort of how they became alienated from the other half of their family, and we learn a bit more about Bridget is the mother, some of her background and skills and experiences that sort of got her to this point. And then the second half of the novel, their con and their pursuit of a mark leads them into a haunted house. It's Halloween weekend in this gated community where sort of literally and figuratively the walls start to close in around them. So yeah, the first half of the novel is about their this mother-son relationship, and then that sort of about their life in a series of motel rooms and shopping malls and operating this con, and then that leads into the second half of the novel in which it all sort of turns on its head.
It's so good. As I said before we started, it was just I could not put it down. It's so much fun, and it's also so beautiful and so sad, and there's just it's really, really lovely. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for saying that.
Oh, no problem. Would you be able to talk a little bit about your journey to the book? Because you said it's fifth, and I'm wondering if you could just talk about sort of your writing career, maybe how it led you to this book.
Sure. So I think more than anything else that I've written, this one seemed rooted in how I started writing when I was a teenager, because when I was in high school, I was really in love with stories of con artists, and I loved novels by like Jim Thompson and also movies like The Sting, and I at one point when I was I believe 16, I convinced one of my teachers to do an independent study in which I would get some school credit for writing it was a screenplay, and so I spent a good chunk of a semester writing this this screenplay that was about con artists, and it was largely based, obviously not in experience, but in just books I'd read, movies I'd seen, and so it was me just trying to work out the mechanics of how stories work, and it wasn't that good, but it was allowed me to kind of I guess gave me the confidence that I can get from the first page to the last page, and somewhere around that time there was a book called The Big Con that was it was, I believe, originally published in 1940 or somewhere around there, and it was an ethnography of con artists. And then it was reissued in the late 90s. And so I remember at Barnes and Noble getting this reissued edition of this book, The Big Con, and I'd heard about it because it had inspired some of the books and movies that I loved. And so I remember getting that, and it sort of lays out just the mechanics of how, or at least how in 1940, these kind of things work, and I really loved it. But from there, I sort of drifted away from those kind of stories, and I began to think of them as kind of the juvenilia, just sort of like that's what I was interested in when I was a kid, but it's not really what interests me anymore. And then early in the pandemic, like a lot of people, I started thinking back to just the kind of books I liked at a younger age, the kind of stories I liked at a younger age, the kind of things I liked writing. And I started thinking about these kind of stories. And I realized that those earlier attempts at writing these kind of stories were always missing some crucial elements, or at least elements that I now recognized as being crucial. And they were, I think, when I was younger, at least, I think that the attraction, both as a reader, as a movie watcher, and as a aspiring writer, the attraction was in, I think, a certain kind of control. It's like when you're involved in a story about con artists, there's like this element of control that it can be really exciting, or at least satisfying, especially when you're a teenager and you're very aware of all the things that you don't have control of. But then I think thinking back to those kind of stories as an adult, I began to sort of bring those sort of bring other elements in there, and started thinking of it as a window into a story of this family. And I think as soon as I sort of did that, it suddenly took on a different kind of life. And I think it became, pursuing this type of story became less about me as the writer trying to exercise a certain kind of control, and it became more about following characters who, for whatever reasons, need that kind of control. And so once I was able to make that shift, that's where I sort of found my way into this story. And so it was a lot of it was fun, and it was exciting to sort of find my way back into a kind of storytelling that had been deeply exciting for me many years ago, but now I could sort of see from a new angle. And then when I was thinking about that idea of control, because like I said, I realized what was interesting is not so much the writer's ability to control something, but rather following those characters who have this need for it. I realized, well, now we have to push it into a space where they absolutely don't have control, where even the physical layout of the space is confusing and overwhelming. And so that's what led me and led the characters into the second half of the novel, which is this where they're wind up in this haunted house, where I sort of like that idea of like this sort of desire for control in the first half, sort of leading them into just the opposite, the space sort of beyond control.
That is so interesting. The con artist is a really interesting figure, because as I was reading, I was kind of thinking that like Bridget certainly, and maybe con artists in general, sort of like have to like pretend to very much be a part of the world while actually kind of like sitting slightly outside of it. And that creates like a lot of really interesting tension,
Yeah.
like the performance and the reality. Could you talk a little bit about yeah, talk a little bit about Bridget maybe and where she came from. Like I never really like asking authors like where do your ideas come from? Because no
Right.
one likes that question and like they don't really come from anywhere. But I do I am interested in inception points. So I'm
Mhm.
wondering like at what point was it that Bridget sort of like came alive for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great question. So I think the point where she came alive to me is when um, I I thought of her as taking on this role of pretending to be this casting director. And when I was a teenager, when I was the age of her son Jake in the novel, I was really involved in acting. And I remember this point in the 90s when I knew people who were submitting audition tapes for themselves to be considered for the role of for lots of different roles in these Star Wars prequels. And that that whole world of kind of um uh you know the sort of film industry far removed from Los Angeles, geographically removed from Los Angeles, but filled with sort of ambition going in all sorts of different directions and excitement. I thought a lot about that and sort of brought some of that into it, and that idea of her of performance, really, like what you said, of um, being the kind of person who gets what she wants or what she needs by eliciting a certain kind of performance from someone else. So she has to perform something in order to kind of activate something in someone else. When I sort of thought about her um, in that light and started thinking back to the kind of experiences that I'd had when I was a teenager, like I said, the age of Jake in this novel, and the kind of different personalities that I would see kind of bopping around um, these spaces that were sort of geographically removed from the film industry, but really invested in it. Suddenly bringing those two elements together, the sort of the attraction of the con, but also this kind of parafilm world that I experienced. Bringing those two together is really kind of the moment that she became real and became someone that I could follow across many pages. And I suddenly had the confidence that I could follow her and she would lead me to some interesting places and surprise me. So
Nice. Yeah, she's really wonderful. She's really complicated. And I love what the book has to say sort of about I guess like the exploitation of children and how that can be sort of like cyclical over generations. Could you talk a little bit about her background, sort of, and how that is like, driving her actions in the present of the novel?
yeah. So her background in the novel is that she when she was a child, she had a very brief stint in this sitcom that led to her kind of separation from her parents, who were not handling that responsibility very well. And then we see this very brief moment where she meets her father again after many years, and um, he has sort of taken this little anecdote of hers and sort of incorporate it into his own story for his own purposes. And that was one of those things, sort of her background, her childhood, sort of leading up to this, was something that turned out to be a surprise while I was writing it. And one of those moments where I was just really kind of following where she took me, and that the way it sort of came to life in her more of the narrative present, where she's or some of the actions sort of leading up to where the novel starts, when she's has her own family and she's raising these kids, is where I saw her as being intensely aware that the experiences that she had, the kind of training in family life that she'd had, did not prepare her for the kind of family that she had, or the family that she wanted, or thought she wanted. And so again, there was a sort of performative element to how she was with her family, that all sort of came out of this kind of this sort of disjunction early in her life, that again is sort of tied up with performance, tied up with the idea of a child performer being a saleable entity to the parents as well. And I think that's certainly the knowledge that she brings to the con that she's running later with her own son, who at times is performing the role of someone other than her son in this con. So yeah, it's sort of is all wrapped up in the idea of performance, both professionally, but then also privately within the family. Yeah.
I really like the scene that you just mentioned where she does meet her father again as an adult, for a lot of reasons, one of which being like, I love the sort of Toastmasters parody happening in that scene. I used to work at a bookstore where we had meetings for that group, and I remember like counting the and all like the filler words, and I was like, is this a good metric for but so I really appreciated that and felt very validated. So I love the way that like that thing that the dad does in like sort of claiming the story is it works so well, like with the sort of things that he did as like a showbiz parent too. They're both about sort of like seeing your children as like an extension of yourself, and that their experiences are yours, and serve you. And so like it was like very crystallizing for me. Could you talk a little bit about the period piece details? Because I was I think in early high school, the year that the novel is set. And it touched on so many things that I remember so well, even just like the TV lineups and, the things that you'd be watching in a motel room. Did you do any additional research beyond your memory in order to bring ideas back to life like that?
Nothing too extensive. I mean, I have just such an intense visceral memory of the channel with the TV guide channel with the scrolling, and my family and I were just recently in a series of hotels ourselves as we sort of moved across the country recently, and now people don't really watch TV the way we did in the pre-streaming era, so it was really alarming to turn on a hotel TV and still see like a version of it there. But a lot of those details just came out of the way I remembered that period, the way I remembered just this sort of the feeling of cheap motel towels at that time, and so there was nothing too extensive, just the sort of exercising of teenage memories, I guess.
Nice. And finally, if we could talk a bit about genre, because I love what this novel is doing with it. And, something that I think about a lot is that like I tend to myself think of genre not as like a label you put on a thing, but like maybe like a buffet that you sort of pick and choose from a little.
Yeah.
And there's so many elements to this book because you have there's like a real kind of realist streak with a depiction of like the family dynamics and all that, but it's also very speculative, especially in the second half.
Mm-hmm.
You have crime and you have horror and family drama. So yeah, could you talk a little bit about what your relationship to genre is here and kind of how you see it working?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way when I was writing it, the way I thought about genre was not so much that I, the writer, am trying to fulfill the requirements of certain genres, but that these characters are sort of pushing themselves into spaces that where those kind of scripts seem like the thing to do, so their characters are making choices to be criminals, and as soon as I got beyond the feeling that I needed to sort of satisfy certain things, and that I could honor the characters in a way that allowed them to interact, sort of pass through a genre, like a room in the haunted house, then it became more like a sort of a setting that we're sort of passing through and interacting with the space, and then we sort of can move through that and then into another setting. And so I think that was a helpful way for me to think about it in a way that still honored the kind of stories that I was that I'd encountered a lot when I was a teenager and had found myself thinking a lot about as I started writing this book, while not feeling constrained by them. And so that's when I started to think about it as these two halves, the sort of the I guess to put it in terms of genre, the crime story first half, haunted house second half, but that the characters were sort of passing through these spaces, and that the second half, the sort of haunted house space where things feel and are more out of control, seems like a natural progression from the sort of attempt at control in the first half. And so that was the way that I kind of tried to think about it, in a way that made all of those elements, made them available to me without feeling like I needed to check things on a box, check things off of a list or anything like that. And I think I've noticed, in terms of, like, I mentioned a minute ago that I didn't want a genre to feel like a constraint, but now that I sort of heard myself say that, I think one of the things that I actually do look for as I'm writing are constraints. they might not be those kind of generic constraints. They might be other types of constraints, like a physical constraint, like a space, or time, something like that. So I think there are ways in which finding constraints can be very, very generative for me. When I realized that the second half of this book could be one night in one location, then it becomes this sort of, pressure cooker that becomes really, really exciting. And I've encountered that with other novels as well, whereas, the way into it might initially feel like avoiding certain types of writerly constraints, but then you find the constraint that really makes it work, the kind of limitation. And that's when the constraint can sort of provide a certain pressure for you to really launch characters into places that, while being constrained in some ways, can lead you to incredible surprises.
It's a great structure, I think, for the character Bridget, because something I spent a lot of time thinking about while reading this is that, like, how much her job includes not just performance but improv, like, and she has to be really dynamic. She has to like have the yes and spirit, to sort of respond to what's happening to her. And so it is really fun to just sort of like get to see how she reacts when you're just like, okay, you're in a horror novel now, what are you going to do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think in terms of like the experiences I've had that sort of helped me write novels, I think when I was a teenager, I was involved in a lot of I did a lot of improv theater, that kind of stuff, and I think that experience actually is pretty foundational to my ability to just sit down and I think push a story into places that are surprising for me, and to sort of follow it and to really find that experience very gratifying and exciting, not stressful and deflating. So yeah, I think it's great that's reflected in the character too, because I think as for myself, that was a pretty foundational skill for learning how to write later.
Nice. And to bring us back full circle to where we started, I think that, like, to be good at improv, you do sort of have, like, there's this paradoxical thing about control happening. It's by acknowledging that you have no control over the situation, you gain it somehow, and like that's what she's doing over and over again in her life. And that's it's really interesting. So thank you for coming to the show and talking about this, and bringing all your ideas.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful insight. I hadn't thought about that, but that really sort of helps illuminate the sort of bring the novel and my process together. So that's wonderful.
Great. Are you working on anything now? What's next for you?
Yeah, I've been working on something that I like. I probably, a lot of writers, I'm nervous to talk about it until it's in some other form. But yeah, I've been continuing to work on something, and am really excited about it. And I'm not usually as cagey as I sound right now. It's just writerly superstition.
It happens across the board. I've come to expect it. I actually don't really know why I still ask the question, because nobody can talk about anything.
Yeah, but it's a good test to see, like, where people are on a sort of superstition spectrum.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, well, thank you again. This has been really lovely, and this book was such a joy. And the reason that I do ask is that, when your next project comes to fruition and is something you can talk about, you're always welcome back to the show. So thank you very
cool.
much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was really nice.
You're very welcome. Okay, listeners, Weft is available right now. So by the time that you hear this, you are able to go to your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go get your books. And I highly recommend that you do. It's really fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.